Is the air you're breathing making you fat? There are a number of studies that have been done by researchers in Canada, the United States, and Europe that show that heavy pollution could have a correlation between bad air and being overweight. So what they did is, of course, there were a number of different studies, and the methodology was different in all of them. But again, they found a strong correlation, although they didn't find causation yet. What one researcher says, Hong Chen, is that we are starting to understand that the uptake and circulation of air pollution in the body can affect more than just the lungs. He did one study, and what they realized with the mice that they were studying is when they had mice in a healthy environment, they were likely to be thinner, healthier. When they took mice and they put them in a highly polluted environment, they gained weight, and they gained weight pretty quickly. After just 10 weeks, the effects were already visible. The mice exposed to the air pollution showed greater volumes of body fat, both around the belly and around the internal organs. At the microscopic level, the fat cells themselves were around 20% larger in the mice inhaling a fine mist of pollutants. What's more, they seem to have become less sensitive to insulin, the hormone that signals to cells to convert blood sugar into energy, the first step towards diabetes. So there are more studies that I'm going to get into in just a second, but this makes a lot of sense. If you guys can remember, we talked about this one other study that compared people in the 1980s to people today. And they specifically compared people who had the same diet and the exact same exercise habits. And they realized that even if you're eating just as healthy and exercising just as much as the people in the 1980s, you're still likely to be 20% more overweight than people in the 1980s. So if it's not diet and it's not exercise, what other factors play a role? We hypothesize that it might have something to do with prescription drugs. Prescription drugs are more available now than they were in the 1980s. But pollution could also have a lot to do with it.
So my answer usually is high fructose corn syrup. But in this case, look, they did the study with this particular issue in mind, and it obviously had an effect. The one fact that led me to really getting a little bit more convinced here is that the one that Anna just read, the fat cells themselves were around 20% larger in the mice inhaling a fine mist of pollutants. Well, that's pretty damning evidence.
Yeah.
You do more studies, but one of the studies that really shook me, again, totally unexpected, was the study of lead and how much it caused the violence in America in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s. And it turns out that once we started taking the lead out of especially out of the cars, the pollutants that the cars were putting out, crime rates started going down all across the country. And when you studied all the different factors that go into crime rates, turns out lead had a shocking effect on us.
Yes.
I shouldn't be that surprised because chemicals affect our bodies in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. So can chemicals lead us to become more violent? Well, apparently, yes. Can they cause us to gain weight for all the reasons that the scientists explain here? Yeah. I mean, it's shouldn't be that surprising.
Yeah, so let me give you some more of this mounting evidence. The tiny irritating particles may also unleash a flood of inflammatory molecules called chronokines to wash through the blood, a response that also triggers immune cells to invade otherwise healthy tissue. Not only does that too interfere with the tissue's ability to respond to insulin, the subsequent inflammation may also interfere with the hormones and the brain processing that govern our appetite. Right, so this pollution might actually have an impact on our appetite. It might make us more hungry. We might eat more as a result of it. Now, there are a bunch of factors that, of course, they have to take into account when they do these types of studies. A lot of these studies took diet into account as a control factor to make sure that diet's not the thing that's kind of throwing the results off.
Of course, they're going to take that into account.
Of course, yeah. So I just want to make sure that you guys know that that was taken into account in the methodology. But another thing to keep in mind is, you know, when you are living in a densely populated area, when you are living in the city, you do have more access to fatty foods, right? So people living in urban areas are more likely to be overweight because of that.
Yeah. So I felt better after the study because until I was 8, I grew up in Turkey where there was more pollution. See, it's not my fault.
It's not your fault.
It screwed up my metabolism. It put my energy off of balance, like this explains, which also explains why I had the banana pecan pancakes for lunch.
I know, the pollution just made you crave them so much.
What can I do?
You couldn't help it.
LA also has bad pollution.
We do.
That's right.
No, but it's frustrating because even if you do everything right, there are factors that are outside of your control that contribute to weight gain. Now, in this case, again, there was correlation. They haven't found causation yet. But nonetheless, it's a factor that could play a huge role. Another thing to take into consideration is the drugs that we take and the antibiotics that are in our foods. All of those things could contribute to weight gain. And so even if you do everything right, sometimes certain things are out of your control.
The risk of developing diabetes rose by about 11% for every 10 micrograms of fine particles in the cubic meter of air. A Swiss study saw similar signs: increased insulin resistance, hypertension, and waist circumference in a sample of nearly 4,000 people living among dust pollution. So that's also an interesting finding. Now, in Asian cities, some of the Asian cities, the pollution is as bad as at least 500 micrograms per cubic meter of air. If 10% leads to 11%, 10 micrograms lead to an 11% increase in diabetes, oh boy, what does 500 lead to?
I know.
So if all of a sudden there's a huge rash of diabetes in China, we might have our answer.